The Senior Rehab Project is supported by the Game Changers, a group of motivated rehab clinicians that are crushing mediocrity and advancing care for older adults. You can join this group of people and get access to the private Facebook group, the monthly meetup with article discussions, and have a say in the direction of this movement. Get off the sidelines and get involved. Just go to seniorrehabproject.com/Game Changers. Hit me!
This is a Senior Rehab Podcast, the podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
All right. Hey, folks, and welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. I'm guest interviewer Dr. Patrick Berner, and I'm joined tonight with Dr. Jake May. I want to go ahead and start by saying thanks to Justin Jones for having us on, and thanks to the Senior Rehab Project for having us as well. So tonight, we're going to be discussing anything and everything nutrition, a pretty big passion of both Jake and I, a topic that really does apply to older adults. So kind of give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about tonight. We'll be discussing a malnutrition project that Jake is a part of that kind of involves a bit of a newsletter, but also a virtual conference that's going to be scheduled for May. The project is a collection of professional groups collaborating to combat malnutrition in older adults from the hospital, critical care, community, public health perspectives. And we'll talk more about this at the end of our conversation. So as I've never hosted before, I'll go ahead and just kind of give my introduction. So I'm Dr. Patrick Berner. I'm a practicing physical therapist in South Carolina, currently working in a skilled nursing facility where I do have my fair share of exposure to older adults. In addition to that, I'm one of only a handful of providers in the country that is also a registered dietitian, a nutritionist. Now, I do practice as both of these within my consulting company, Fuel Physio LLC. I love being a movement expert, as many of us as PTs refer ourselves to be, but I even more loving being a healthcare provider, trying to keep people out of the healthcare system, integrating both movement, nutrition, and all other elements of life. So as I said, I'm joined tonight by Dr. Jake May, who among many other things is a member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and a part of the Healthy Aging Dietetic Practice Group. Now, for those of you who don't know, within the Academy, practice groups are very similar to those sections that we have within the APTA. But I'll go ahead and I'll let kind of Jacob give more of a formal introduction and a background for himself.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. Happy to be here and glad to be able to have this conversation with everybody. So I have my PhD in kinesiology, nutrition, and rehabilitation sciences from the University of Illinois, Chicago, but I am also a registered dietitian. So naturally, one of my major passions is nutrition and especially clinical nutrition. So I currently work as a postdoctoral research fellow. And my previous work has really revolved around skeletal muscle metabolism, especially in diabetes and obesity. In particular, our lab uses what's called a clinical translational research model. This just means we combine bench work with clinical human outcome measures. So, for example, we might do experiments growing muscle cells in petri dishes. And in the context of diabetes, we might incubate them with sugar or insulin and see how they respond. But then we also bring in human volunteers, and most commonly we perform what's known as the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. And that's a really fancy clinical method that helps us best understand someone's insulin sensitivity. And I'm going to describe it just a bit because I think it's really cool what we do. We essentially take an individual, lay them down on a hospital bed, and infuse them with both glucose and insulin to see how their muscles respond to those infusions. So what we do is we take the cell culture data, we take the human data, and we put that together as best we can to draw conclusions. And so that's the essential basis behind our clinical translational research approach. More currently and more related to this talk, I'm working on a project with teams at the Cleveland Clinic to try and identify molecules in people's breath that might actually be able to predict their malnutrition status. So that's kind of my background and kind of how my passions lie in the field of nutrition. So Patrick, I'll kick it back to you, but I'm really looking forward to getting a great chat together.
Awesome, Jake, and I appreciate again having you on tonight. And I mean that's a pretty impressive background, but then also the things that you're working on are amazing in a sense that it really comes down to the molecular level of things of trying to, like you said, even using people's breath to identify malnutrition. I mean, that could essentially be a game changer within the healthcare system.
Yeah, we certainly have high hopes.
Kind of moving with our topic, like we said, it's going to be anything and everything nutrition. And for anyone that kind of knows me, I speak loudly on nutrition within physical therapy practice. So Justin had asked me to come on and host tonight's podcast for that fact. And it is kind of interesting to have Jake and I kind of speak on this topic, being that we both are registered dietitians. Justin had posted some questions to the Facebook group. People kind of responded with what they wanted us to kind of chat on about tonight. So I've kind of picked the top 5 or 6 that kind of stuck out to me and Jake, and I'm going to just go down the list and we'll hit these as they come. So first question comes from Dustin Jones, and he asks, is discussing nutrition within our scope of practice as a physical therapist? And hold on, it's got more. Why does nutrition matter? And what are the 3 fundamental principles PT should grasp in discussing this topic with our patients?
Oh boy, what an awesome question, right? So I can answer this from the registered dietitian perspective, not necessarily from the physical therapist perspective, but I would say that discussing nutrition is absolutely within your scope of practice. I think it is very important as, being a member of the healthcare team, whether you're an MD, a PT, an RD, to really understand everyone's individual role and expertise, but also understand that there's overlap. And having good communication and collaboration between different fields of expertise is really important. As long as you're approaching this really from a collaborative standpoint, not from the perspective of worrying about you're stepping on another clinician's toes or trying to create some sort of power struggle, which for those of you that have worked in the clinic, it's unfortunately a situation that sometimes arises between individuals of different practice groups. So I would say 100% within your scope of practice, just give some recognition that the dietitian is really the expert in nutrition, but most certainly open up a communication with them and talk about nutrition and talk about your patient.
Absolutely, Jake. And I agree 100% that it certainly is something that is within our scope and something that we should be discussing with all of our patients. And it's actually within our House of Delegates statements that they actually kind of came together and produced this statement that kind of implements it within our Practice Act. And it's titled The Role of the Physical Therapist in Diet and Nutrition. And I won't read it word for word, but every physical therapist should know that this statement exists. And it basically hints that, it's the role of the PT to screen for and provide information on diet and nutrition to not only patients and clients, but also the community. But staying within that scope of practice, but then also including appropriate referrals to nutritional professionals when that advice or education is outside of the scope. I mean, kind of moving a little bit more into scope and kind of being my perspective on this, just because I've read into it quite a bit. And as I try and educate physical therapists how to implement this appropriately, is that it is dependent on state by state. A physical therapist scope of practice, as we know, is going to vary state by state, but the nutrition laws vary as well. So it's important for a PT to know that, a nutrition scope of practice, for example, in Colorado or Arizona is very free in that they really have no legal protection at all. Anyone can give nutritional advice. Their statutes actually just say that the layperson should just double check that the person they're working with has some sort of credentials. But then you take the state of North Carolina right above me, who's one of the strictest states in the country when it comes to practicing in nutrition and dietetics. And their statutes specifically state that only a registered licensed dietitian can even provide advice when it comes to nutrition. So it's definitely within our scope. It's just knowing those legal boundaries. And like I said, it's going to be specific state to state.
Yeah. And That's a really great point to bring up, because I'm sure many of us practice in different states. I'm up in Cleveland, Ohio right now, and we fight pretty heavily to protect the role of the registered dietitian, especially in the clinic. So, even if you are in a state where the nutrition laws are a little more laxed, I would still make sure you approach your dietitian, even if it's just with kind of basic questions about nutrition, just so the dietitian knows that you're coming at this from a collaborative standpoint, as opposed to being something where maybe you're just a really knowledgeable practitioner, and you just don't want to come across that you're feeling like you know more about nutrition than the dietitian. So understanding the state's laws is 100% important. And I would just also remember, look at it from the perspective of the other individual. So if you had another practitioner coming in and maybe working in your field house, make sure you come at it with the approach of a very collaborative approach. Otherwise, you do run the risk of creating some sort of aggression from the other groups that you really want to prevent. If you want a quick tip about how to prevent this sort of situation from happening, I highly recommend talking to the other members of your healthcare team before a situation that you want to discuss arises. So, for example, if you're practicing as a PT and you notice a nutrition risk, absolutely bring that to your dietitian. But to make sure that's coming across the right way, if you go out and look for your dietitians outside of an exact clinical reason, just to say hi and introduce yourself, that really creates a good rapport between you and the RD, so that when situations come up, it's a lot easier to understand you're coming at it from this kind and collaborative perspective. So I do highly recommend having a relationship with the other members of the healthcare team, whether it's an RD or an RN or an MD, all the same.
No, and that's a perfect point to make, Jake, and that is something that every clinician should be taking into consideration. It's certainly something that I do, and it does, eventually come out to the other RD in the facility that I am an RD as well. So we had spoke about this offline earlier, that I start picking up on clinical things and start getting into them quicker than they would even notice it. Just because us as physical therapists, we see our patients most often and a lot sooner than a lot of other healthcare providers, in a sense that primary care would first. But even in the sense of utilizing direct access that we have, there's a lot of instances where that physical therapist is going to be the first person, if not the only person that person may see as a healthcare provider. So it's creating those collaborative teams in order to kind of get the best treatment and intervention.
Yeah, and that's an outstanding point, because, depending on your facility, or even depending on how busy a single facility is in a day, the dietitian may not be able to see the patients so frequently like some of the PTs may. And it really is important that as a PT, you're taking notice about the nutritional habits. And if you see something that's startling, it's important to bring that up to the dietitian. Especially if you're working on, rehabilitation and muscle strength is an issue, or, putting back on a reasonable amount of body weight so these individuals aren't so frail. That's something where nutrition plays a very huge role too. And so this collaboration between PTs and RDs really should kind of be intrinsic. So it's important that everyone on the healthcare team knows that. And I think a lot of people around the country do create this nice open dialogue. But I think it could definitely be better done in other situations. So when you go back to your clinics, it would be outstanding if you would chat with other members of your team and bring this sort of conversation up and ask within your clinic, is there a way where we can just have chats with other members of the healthcare team and make sure the dialogue is there for when something needs to be chatted about, it can be discussed.
Absolutely. I agree 100% on that, Jake. Before I move on to the next question here, I just want to address Dustin's last point of giving 3 fundamental principles. I'm just going to kind of give my 2 cents in here, and I actually believe there's really 6 that every clinician kind of needs to think about. The first one being that having the clinician, the PT, understand that nutrition does impact rehab outcomes. It does depict their risk of developing chronic diseases, and then those 2 combined, kind of their overall quality of life. Number 2 being nutritional screening should be a part of every plan of care of a physical therapist, right? It goes back to what's in our practice act and what's in our scope of practice, that we should be at the bare minimum screening to identify whether or not that collaborative approach needs to occur. Third thing, taking into account the patient or client's medical history, identifying whether or not that patient nutritional intervention, if it is going to be something that's outside of your scope and something that is best served, handled by a registered dietitian. The fourth point being scope of practice, like I brought up earlier, the scope of practice of both a physical therapist and a dietitian. Fifth point, the personal scope of practice for the clinician, right? Are you comfortable with talking about what a patient's eating, what they're consuming? Do you have that level of knowledge to speak on it? Because when it comes to what people eat, it's very personalized, right? It's depending upon their culture, their social economic status. So you as a clinician need to be comfortable in talking about those things. And then the sixth point, it's that decision by the clinician, taking into account the other 5 points. And it's the decision of, are you going to intervene yourself, or are you going to refer to a registered dietitian or create that collaborative team approach like Jake mentioned?
Really outstanding fundamentals. I mean, that's something where if you're a practitioner, I mean, just hearing it, I'm not a PT, but that sounds like something I'd love to have a list in front of me on a post-it note, just to make sure I consider all those things going into, these sort of situations. Really outstanding. I think that's something everyone should have access to as a PT practitioner.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next question, and again, it is from Dustin Jones. But I put it in here just because it's actually a really good question. So, Dustin states, can you speak to the amount of nutritional training that healthcare providers receive? I think he's primarily mentioning physicians, because then he comments, my wife received a 3-hour class in med school or nutrition, yet medical doctors are easily viewed as authorities in this department.
Yeah, it's a topic that I think definitely the MD training program is aware of a deficit there. So, I can't speak towards exactly what their training involves, but I do know just from speaking with practicing MDs that it's really not very thorough. It's kind of basic because they have so many other items that they really need to consider and be experts on. And that's where the dietitian can kind of really come into play, is playing that role of the nutrition expert. But I will say it's something that a lot of programs are working on. I know just from the work I do with the Healthy Aging Dietetic Practice Group, I had an MD on the other day, and they're initiating a new educational paradigm, essentially, where they're implementing nutrition and exercise training within their MD program. So it's something that is currently changing, but it's certainly not optimal. And that's where having a collaborative practice is really beneficial.
No, absolutely. And I guess, Jake, is there any specific reason that you would think that a medical doctor is not getting a sufficient amount of training?
Yeah, I mean, I don't build curriculums or anything, but my general perspective would be there's so many other major issues that the MD or primary care physician needs to be concerned with. Finding the right diagnosis, understanding the whole body perspective on an individual, and really integrating that all together into one sound diagnosis or perspective on an individual. That would just be my kind of perception at this point, but I don't have too much other insight on that.
Okay, no, great. And kind of tailoring off that question, Christy Zahner had mentioned that in her experience, primary care providers are not really knowledgeable in nutrition and food sensitivities. So what I took with that question was that, Christy was kind of delving into the depth, right, of nutrition. And that, food sensitivity is one of those things that, in my opinion, is something that it takes a lot of depth and a lot of knowledge and education on. So I guess I'll give you this opportunity, Jake, to kind of speak on the education of a dietitian, right? What it takes to become a registered dietitian, and why you would consider them to be the experts in nutrition compared to an MD who, due to time constraints and due to the amount of information they have to be educated on, and that their profession is solely, treating medical conditions and diagnoses. Why is that RD that expert? What's their background look like?
Oh, sure. So, this is something we really pride ourselves on as, once we obtain that RT credentials, because we go through so much strict training just on the concept of nutrition. So all RDs, at least in the United States, have to go through a didactic program for dietetics from an accredited institution. And what this generally involves is about 4 years of full-time study, or about 120 credit hours, specifically within curriculum designed for the progress to become a dietitian. Also, they're actually making this even more stringent. Effective January 1st of 2024, all dietitian candidates will be required to have a master's degree. So they're really building in that long-term background of nutrition knowledge before even letting you get into a situation of doing supervised practice, which is another main component of becoming a dietitian. We're required to have 1,200 hours of supervised practice. So again, not only learning the education and the book smarts, but really getting supervised practice from dietitians and getting hands-on experience. And then beyond that, like many credentials, we're required to pass from who all of us have taken it, I'm sure we would describe it as a grueling national certification exam. So this combination between the curriculum from accredited institutions, the combination of the supervised practice experience, and then making sure you can pass the national exam is really why the registered dietitian, or many are going by the term registered dietitian nutritionist. It's all the same. That is why we consider ourselves to be the food and nutrition expert on the healthcare.
Absolutely, Jake. And just to kind of give a little addition to that, because a dietitian doesn't solely work within the healthcare system. As they're not always working in hospitals or clinics like you would traditionally think. Our education depth goes even deeper into as far as food service, right? Being able to run restaurants, run food corporations, anything that has to do with production. There's that whole managerial side of being a dietitian as well that I don't think a lot of people even know about.
Yeah, it was actually one of my favorite rotations going through my internship, but that's a really great point you bring up. And I'm glad you're sharing that with all the PTs, just because I always think it's better if you have a better understanding of what your fellow clinicians go through, to get their credential, and it helps you better understand what their expertise is. So that's a really great point.
Kind of moving down to the next question here, was actually something that I put in, but we've already kind of answered it as far as who are the experts in nutrition. But I actually do have one question for myself. I know in my personal experience, sometimes it's hard to come across a registered dietitian, and I know I hear this from other clinicians across the country that they just don't have one in their community or access to one. What would you tell a PT in that situation to do?
Yeah, that's a tough situation. What I would really do there is I would try and get in contact with some sort of RD somehow, even if it's not directly involved with your healthcare team. But outside of that, you could take a look at the handouts that our kind of overarching organization, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. You can look into some of our position papers on nutrition topics. So let's say that you have a client asking you about non-calorie sweeteners, let's just say, and you don't really know what the best stance or the best response to that is. Well, you can go to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and you can look into what their position stands are. And that will give you a really good perspective. And you'd find that, having a, non-calorie sweetener is so much healthier for someone than having a sugary beverage, because you're reducing that sugar content, if we're just speaking about, the average person. So, using those sort of information databases from, actual practice groups would actually be a good recommendation from my end, just to keep you well informed on any given situation or any hot topic in nutrition.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. And I would say, just to kind of throw out a couple resources, eatright.org, right? Our Academy's webpage for the public end has a lot of good information. ChooseMyPlate.gov is another one. Though I most recently prefer the guidelines that Canada put out and Brazil, their most recent guidelines too. I prefer theirs a little bit better. Just personally, they touch on a couple other things that are important to food and nutrition, taking into account other behavior aspects of a person, and not just their sole, food selection choices.
Interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up. I'll have to check them out, as I haven't just yet. That's outstanding.
Yeah, they're I like both of them. They're straight and to the point. And I tweeted this out probably a couple of days ago that Canada's really, in my opinion, up their game on these guidelines end of last year and this year, because their physical activity guidelines that they just posted for kids and teens was actually quite outstanding as well. And they're giving it language that's simple for the general public to kind of understand and consume.
I'm really glad you brought up that you tweeted this out as well, because I am actually a huge advocate for evidence-based professionals to be active on social media, especially Twitter, because I'm sure, as you all know, there's so much poor information out there. The more of us there are that are spreading good information or obtaining good information from those sort of resources and sharing it with the public, all the better. So on that end, I would also like to say there are actually a couple clinical institutes that are very active on social media that are absolutely outstanding and would be really good to help kind of enrich your more typical curriculum knowledge base. And that is the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic. They both have absolutely outstanding social media accounts, and they share items that are very relevant to the public. Quick tip sort of items that you as a practitioner can read and utilize in your daily practice. If someone asks you a very basic question related to health or nutrition, you'll have a quick, easy answer that's been verified by two major clinical institutes in the United States.
Awesome, Jake. I appreciate you mentioning that. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes as well to remind people. And that's their Twitter accounts that you're referring to, correct?
Yes.
Moving on to the next question here. And this comes from Teresa Wazer. And she states, obviously whole, real food choices are the best. But what would you recommend if a person needed to take some type of protein powder or protein bar if they were typically not eating enough protein within their diet?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And, most certainly from the dietitian perspective, we're always going to try and do interventions that are based on consuming whole food items first. But sometimes you run into situations where, whether it's due to appetite or just maybe some sort of physical issue like dentition on an individual, getting enough nutrients or protein in really becomes a problem. In terms of recommending some sort of protein or meal replacement, I would use ones that are also recommended clinically. So, this isn't a promo or anything, but Ensure by Abbott Nutrition, I have been extremely impressed with their products and the research they put in to creating different products for different purposes. They have high-calorie protein shakes, low-calorie protein shakes. They really vary the flavors to make sure that, if you're recommending this to someone, they can change it up to make sure they continue to drink it. Because I'm sure you all know, if you drank the same exact thing 2 or 3 times a day for months on end, you'd eventually get tired of it. So just personally, Ensure has been one of the best brands in my mind for helping individuals kind of increase the protein or just calories in their diet.
That's good, Jake. And that it kind of brings up another point here. And I'm going to Teresa's got another pretty important part to her question that I'll come back to, but I want to skip down to something that Michelle Sanders brought up. And specifically because you had mentioned Ensure, and we kind of know, you and I know the exposure that they've had recently in the media. Is the benefit of the protein in those supplements worth the high amount of sugar that's found in those?
Yeah, boy, is that a great question. It really kind of got, blown out of proportion when the media took hold of it, because, there's a big, anti-sugar push right now, which for the normal, everyday, healthy person, I'd say is probably very relevant, right? You really do want to minimize the amount of added sugar in your diet. We know it's just associated with so many negative health outcomes and obesity, if nothing else. However, you definitely want to consider the situation of the individual that's getting recommended these beverages. So for many Ensure products, they're being recommended to individuals because they can't get enough calories in. So if having a little extra sugar in a drink is, one, helping them make sure they consume all of it or consume it consistently, then it is doing so much good that any sort of negative aspect of having that, sugar within the drink, it's really counterbalanced by what's more important for the individual. So I would say for the vast majority of individuals being recommended Ensure as meal replacements or as meal supplements, that sugar in there is really not a concern. It's really only performing a beneficial function in terms of giving them calories and making sure they are consuming what they need to consume.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly what I was thinking, Jake, is that it really wasn't that big of a deal as the media had kind of made it out to be. Mainly specifically because I know that the calorie intake is going to far outweigh the sugar content. But yeah, I guess my next question would kind of be, though, do you have any examples of a particular patient that this would kind of fall in line with?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the most common in my mind is the malnourished or the sarcopenic, right? So you have individuals that have low muscle mass due to most likely years of undernutrition. And if the first goal is to be able to get them to a situation where they're better apt in terms of just being more mobile or moving around, the only situation you're going to want is to make sure that they have enough protein and they have enough calories to make sure their body can build back up to what it needs to be. So that's one of the most important situations for, where these, if we're talking about Ensure, where their meal supplements are going to be very beneficial. And that sugar in there is really only performing a beneficial purpose. Ensure particularly has a drink called Ensure Enlive. So I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with this, but it was really some brilliant work that culminated from a handful of individuals. But what they did is they actually supplemented their, Ensure protein drink with extra amino acids that are particularly geared toward helping improve kind of your muscle strength and muscle recovery. And so Ensure has done an outstanding job at really targeting their products at individuals. And that's a perfect situation where, the sugar in there is really not a negative. It's really a positive to get those calories in and to make that product taste where it needs to be, so that individuals that don't have the right taste receptors anymore, or maybe just aren't eating enough, are able to consume that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another thing I kind of thinking in terms of what you're saying is, what I'm hearing is that the benefit far outweighs the risks of anything that sugar would potentially be doing, and it's avoiding the alternative, which is being malnourished. So I guess if you can speak on that just a little bit, so that some of our clinicians kind of understand what being malnourished as a patient actually means and what the risks of that are.
Oh, sure. I mean, in terms of seeing malnourished individuals, you have them come into the clinic, and many of them are obvious, right? You see signs of muscle wasting, you see muscle weakness. Oftentimes, you'll even see fat wasting. So, we do what's called nutrition-focused physical exams, where we'll specifically look for areas of muscle wasting. We'll look at the temporal muscle. You can see that, right above the outside of your eyes, essentially. And, you can see that on some individuals, it dips in real far. And they're not getting enough protein, they're not getting enough calories, and their body is essentially eating away at their protein stores. Well, what's the main storage of amino acids in your body? It's your muscles. So unfortunately, if you're not getting the right amount of nutrients in, you're creating a situation where your body has to burn up its own sources, primarily skeletal muscle in this case. And what happens with that? Well, you see a loss of strength, you see a loss of mobility, and it kind of creates this snowball effect with individuals. Well, okay, well now if I'm feeling weaker and I'm not feeling so strong, maybe I move a little less. And that fits right in with the physical therapy arena, where now you have individuals that are also sedentary. And so you're creating a situation where their muscles are not moving, their muscles are not getting protein, and you generate this malnourished sarcopenic state that unfortunately falls off very quickly, especially in older individuals. We see that dramatic dip in terms of their mortality and their muscle mass really getting into the 70s and 80s, where their mobility and their muscle mass really drops down if they're not having proper nutrition and good physical activity every day.
Man, Jake, that's a pretty detailed picture that you just painted, and it really identifies and verifies that nutrition and malnutrition and the avoidance of it is something that definitely plays a part and is applicable to the field of physical therapy. So in terms of, I'm a clinician and I may be trying to avoid that. And to me, protein is something that is important. So going back to the rest of Teresa Wazer's question, what do you recommend for protein intake for the active older adult?
Yeah, boy, this is another outstanding question. So whoever the listeners are who are submitting these questions, you guys are outstanding. So this is a highly debated topic right now, right? Because we have these protein recommendations that are sitting at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's kind of your generic protein recommendation. That can certainly change when you get into situations where people are malnourished, but what about the situation in these active older adults? I will say this, you do have to go by where our current guidelines are, but there's been a lot of outstanding research as of late that really looks into protein and muscle metabolism in older individuals specifically. So, if any of you are interested in reading primary literature, I do highly recommend getting on PubMed and searching for individuals like Blake Rasmussen or Elena Volpe out of University of Texas Medical Branch, Stuart Phillips out of McMaster up in Ontario, and Luc van Loon out of Maastricht in the Netherlands. And we'll put these names and maybe their bios in the show notes, but these individuals collectively have done some really amazing work that helps us better understand how protein metabolism works in younger versus older individuals. So let me take a quick step back and just tell you what kind of happens when a young person eats protein, right? So if you're a young, healthy individual and you consume a meal that has, let's just say, around 20 or so grams of protein, your muscles and your body realize that you brought that protein in, and it starts building your muscles immediately. So over the course of time, let's say you start as a young adolescent and you're eating an adequate amount of protein, 20 grams in every meal. You grow, you come to be big and strong, and that's outstanding. However, what we see is in older individuals, let's say you're 65 years old, if you give them the same 20-gram protein meal, for whatever reason, their body doesn't sense that quite as much, and they don't build that muscle up because of it. Well, I'm sure you all know that, throughout any given day, your body goes through cyclic processes of building muscle when you eat and losing muscle when you're fasting or when you're in that postprandial state. And so this is a cyclic event that happens. And at the end of the day, in a young individual, if you've had 20 grams of protein in your breakfast, lunch, dinner, you end up with, a net no change in your muscle mass at the end of the day, or maybe even some growth. However, in these older individuals, even if they're eating the same amount of protein, because they're only getting that 20-gram dose, that their body isn't responding to it as well. And at the end of the day, they actually end up in a net deficit, and they end up losing a little bit of muscle protein. Extrapolate that over decades, and what do you know? We have this situation where we're losing muscle mass in older individuals, even though we're eating protein. However, again, these groups have really investigated this further and found that, you know what? If we take these older individuals and instead of 20 grams of protein at their meal, let's give them 40 grams of protein at one meal. And what do they see happens? Their protein or muscle responses to that 40-gram dose is exactly the same as a younger individual's at the 20-gram dose. So increasing this amount of protein at a single meal for older individuals seems to kind of be enough to create that stimulus for their muscles to build. So there's certainly a lot of evidence behind not only increasing the protein recommendations for older individuals, but actually adding on this newer concept of whether you want to call it protein timing, maybe you want to call it meal by meal protein doses. It seems to have a lot of relevance specifically for those older individuals. So, I mean, this is really some outstanding research that has been done, but I do want to remind you all that although it is very important to stay up to date on all the newest and groundbreaking research, and especially items like this where I'm certainly hopeful that it makes it well into our recommendations from institutions like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and reaches into our practice guidelines. To my knowledge, it's not there just yet. And so it is very important to make sure that, you know, we take into account the individuals that are making these guidelines are taking all these items into consideration. And when we get to the breaking point where the research has become reproducible enough and it seems beneficial enough to make changes, I'm really confident that will happen. So again, I'm very happy to share all this information because it's exciting and near and dear to my heart because I'm close to skeletal muscle protein metabolism. But I do want to caution that, you know, we do have to abide by our recommendations from our kind of overarching institutions.
Yeah, Jake, and those are, I mean, that research is phenomenal and the results that they're seeing. And I really do hope that it does become something that's implemented within our practice guide. But it brings up a question that I get sometimes, and it more is in a sense with dealing with teenagers and athletes, right? Is there a such thing as having too much protein?
Great question, right? So here's the issue in terms of, too much protein. If you want a generic maximal guideline, I would say if you get anywhere over, 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight, per kilogram of body weight. Oof, almost messed everyone up right there. Guys, let me repeat this. 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. You're about hitting the maximal dose where that's going to be beneficial for the majority of individuals. Now, if you have particular situations where we start talking about elite athletes or bodybuilders, stuff can get very different. But for the majority of casual high school collegiate athletes, if you want a blanket number to kind of reach around as a maximum goal, 1.5 grams per kilogram. And this is about where I would go. Now, is there a downside to going over that? I don't really think so. Unless there's some sort of underlying kidney issue, which again, in the majority of healthy individuals, that's not going to be the case. There's not really harm to going over, but I do find it easier to take care of the rest of your nutritional needs if you save those calories and that space in your stomach for something else. For example, maybe you need some more healthy fats in your diet, or especially in the case of an athlete, maybe you really need to make sure you're getting enough carbohydrates in to maximize your muscle glycogen stores and really get the best performance at your events. So although, I really don't think there's a downside to going over the 1.5 grams per kilogram, which is where we find essentially maximal benefit. Again, without a downside of going over, I do think you run the risk of unfortunately replacing nutrients that could also help you in other ways, like carbohydrates.
And I think, Jake, that's a very important point for people to understand, is that it's not necessarily that the additional protein is causing harm. It's just within your macronutrient breakdown of the foods that you're consuming. Like you said, you're taking the place of something else that could be more beneficial to your needs. Would you change, though, your protein recommendations for an older adult, whether they're active or sedentary?
So that's a great question, and I think I would. It would depend more on the exact individual and their nutritional goals. I do think we're at a point where, my feeling at least is that the majority of older adults can use a higher protein recommendation than we currently have in the guidelines. Does that differ if you're active? It depends how active, right? So if you have a recreationally active individual, it's likely that the sedentary individual may need that same amount of protein to make sure they're not wasting away. Whereas the active individual may want to have that amount of protein so that they're building a little more muscle. So I would take it on an individual basis, because you really have to consider the entire situation, the person's nutritional goals, and really put that all together to create the best guideline for them. So I apologize, but I don't really have a very good blanket statement for that one.
Oh, no worries there. And it really just shows that for these kind of recommendations and interventions, I mean, it's individualized. And it comes down to what that individual person needs, and not just giving blanket statements out for the most part, because that information may not be applicable to them.
Yeah, and that's one of the beauties I love about nutrition, right? So much of our job as RDs is, yes, we need to make sure we have the right nutritional advice, but a lot of it is just working with other individuals. And that's one of my favorite part of, my work as primarily a researcher. A lot of what I do actually involves counseling individuals on their nutrition. And the benefit I get as a researcher is I get a lot more time than we do in the clinic to be able to sit down with someone and really talk with them about their concerns and their issues, and really get to know them as a person, which that's certainly the goal of an outpatient RD. But in the research setting, we tend to have a little more freedom and time to do that, which I personally love.
So next question we've got, and I think this is the last one that we'll have time for tonight, comes from Celeste Ferguson. And she states that I found many of my patients don't drink water at all. Do you have any tips on how they can increase their hydration?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one. And I'm sure for many of you that work with older adults, you understand the situation, right? We know that, their thirst sensations are decreasing. We know that they have issues with taste, or maybe sometimes their teeth are really sensitive and the temperature of the water is frustrating, or sometimes they just plain forget to drink. And so you do run into this situation in older individuals a lot. So there are ways to really help combat some of those issues. If you're looking for a way to help them drink more, there's things you can do, like use fruit-infused water. Sometimes in older adults, having just that little bit of flavor in there really helps them kind of taste and enjoy that water a little more. Other things you can do is utilize high hydrating foods, right? So this would be a lot of your fruits and vegetables, especially ones that are very juicy or very crisp. That crispness is usually due to having water content within the cells of, that fruit or vegetable. And when you crunch down on it, it's kind of those water-filled cells bursting. So using items like cucumber or watermelon, grapes, incorporating that into meals of older adults is a really great way to increase their hydration without necessarily having to sit there and say, hey, drink this glass of water, because sometimes that is a barrier in itself. Other things you could do is smoothies are an outstanding source of being able to get, maybe calories in if that's your goal, or getting extra fruits and vegetables in, and especially in this situation, hydration. So, I think any one of those situations could be really beneficial, either doing it from maybe making the water easier for them to handle in terms of their taste sensation, or giving them some hydrating foods.
Yeah, absolutely, Jake. I mean, those are fantastic recommendations. And to me, it just sounds like real simple, easy things that a clinician can just mention to a patient or client to kind of help them with those hydration needs. Kind of at a clinician level, on a PT level, their intervention nutritionally could just be giving those helpful hints.
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. Those are nice, quick, easy, simple tips that you can really pretty easily give to your patients. Sometimes you do have to be aware of, other diagnoses, right? If you're working with someone with heart failure or kidney failure, the actual water intake, they may be limited in some situations. So, that's a great time to just check into the background of your patient. And if there's a question or a concern, if you're reading the medical notes and you're not really sure if it's a good idea to recommend more water, quick and easy, talk to the RD, call them up, give them a call. But do understand that, as a physical therapist, you have the training, you can make good judgment calls. Just know when you need to refer out and know when you can make some of these great recommendations like, hey, why don't you eat more fruits and vegetables? That's a really generic recommendation, but it works so well in so many situations that it's almost always a quick and easy thumbs up from the RD if you're going to tell that to someone.
Yeah, I don't think I'd ever tell anybody not to say that. Yeah. Oh, goodness. So before we wrap up, Jacob, is there any kind of closing remarks or anything dealing with nutrition in the older adult population specifically that you didn't get a chance to mention?
I mean, there's so many issues in the older adult, and there's a lot of research going into various topics. To be honest, I could sit down here with a beer and chat with you for hours on end. So this was an outstanding conversation in terms of chatting about, the malnutrition issue in older adults, and especially how it relates to the physical therapy, clinician standpoint. I had a blast chatting about it.
Oh, so did I, Jake. It turned out quite well, and I hope every clinician that's listening kind of got those little nuggets of information that they can take back and apply tomorrow, right? That they can see their patient or client. So on my end, I just wanted to mention to everybody listening, through my consulting company, Fuel Physio, I do educate physical therapists on how to appropriately integrate nutrition into their practice and identifying whether or not it's something you as a PT should be addressing and identifying when that need for referral needs to happen. I personally can be found on Twitter where I live, as I think Jake does as well, at the Fuel Physio. So Jake, I want to give this opportunity to you to kind of let our listeners know where you can be found. If they have any questions, if they want to reach out to you personally. But I also want to give you the time to talk about this malnutrition project that you're working on.
Yeah, I'm really excited to share this information with you all because I think it's something that can really benefit all members of the healthcare team. So our group is, the Healthy Aging Dietetic Practice Group. So one of our primary concerns is the nutritional needs, specifically in older adults. And we have put together our first live virtual conference that's going to occur May 22nd of this year from 12 to about 4:30 Eastern time. So I can put more details in the show notes, but what we're doing is we collected multiple unique perspectives from a variety of interdisciplinary experts to chat about not only approaches to treating malnutrition in acute care, subacute care, and also community settings, but really to engage in discussions on how to improve malnutrition care moving forward. Specifically, some of you may know Dr. Richard Severin. He's a physical therapist, and he's actually finishing up his PhD research right now, but he's going to talk about different nutritional research directions that we can take to maybe help the collaborative efforts between PTs and RDs. We have Dr. David Buys, who is from Mississippi, and he's a state health expert, and he's done some outstanding research on delivering meals to patients' homes after they leave the hospital. And then I know many of you work in the home setting. We have a group of people from Meals on Wheels, so dietitians that work with Meals on Wheels, and they did some really cool research looking into what the main nutritional issues are in the homebound people from that first person perspective. So it's really an exciting conference. It is free for all of our Healthy Aging Dietetic Practice Group members. So if you know an RD who's already a member of our overarching group, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, it's only about $10 to be a member of our group, and then you get free access to the webinar. Otherwise, it is $50 for entry, but I know that's tough for students. So if you're a student and if you are interested, send me an email. My permanent email address, and we'll put it in the show notes, but it's just jake.may@case.edu. We'll be looking into alternatives for students to really cut that cost down or see what we can do to make sure you can get access to this really outstanding conference on malnutrition that is specifically related in many senses to the physical therapy perspective as we've chatted about today. So I do just really appreciate Dustin and the Senior Rehab Project for having us be able to chat about this exciting conference we have going on. And then Patrick, man, I can't thank you enough for kind of heading this and having this discussion. I think it's so unique that you're a PT and an RD, and it's really a special connection. And I think any of you that are listening really should reach out to Patrick if you have questions about nutrition related stuff, because he just has some outstanding insight, and I've had a joy chatting about it.
I appreciate it, Jake, and I thank you for the comments as well. And I look forward to the conference in May. I've actually got as we know, for the Academy, our membership renewals in May. So I think I'm actually I'll tag on the Healthy Aging practice group while I'm at it. So I can kind of delve in a little bit more. So looking forward to it. Awesome, Jake. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and remember to check the show notes for anything that we had mentioned.
Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. If you only listen to these podcast episodes, you are missing out on 90% of the Senior Rehab Project. Hop on over to seniorrehabproject.com, where you can join the movement that's advancing care for older adults. You can join for free or become a part of the Game Changers, where you can get some free gear and access to our monthly meetup. Just go to seniorrehabproject.com. I appreciate y'all, and I'll talk with you soon. But in the meantime, do not forget to stay funky.